Thank you. It's good to be here. And I was saying to somebody yesterday that the BERA conference in Liverpool was my first proper conference as an early career researcher, as we would call me now. But this was 29 years ago. And at the time, I was halfway through a part-time PhD at the institution that had just become the University of the West of England, having been Bristol Poly for many years. And we drove a minibus of colleagues up for that event. It was a joyful occasion. It was a very formative occasion. It was also a very supportive one. And I think, you know, the spirit of that is something I remember very fondly. It's quite interesting, actually, that there's a fantastic thing on my badge, which I don't know whether it's deliberate. It says ECR, Early Career Researcher, or it might stand for Exceptionally Critical Researcher. I don't know, one or the other. Anyway, I'm going to keep it on for now. Okay. I want to try and give you a bit of an insight into how the REF worked, perhaps some reminders for some of you. It won't be equally known to you what the thing is and how it works. So let's get going. There are really these segments in what I want to say, something about the way in which 2021 compares to 2014. I want to say a bit about the education submissions that were, as it were, received by REF 2021. I want to say a bit about how the sub-panel worked, a little bit about who they are, perhaps, as well, and then a bit about educational outcomes, what came out the end of it, with a little bit of comparison with 2014. Fifthly, comparing REF to other quality assessment processes. I think that's very important to at least acknowledge that comparison here. I won't have time to go into great depth. And lastly, say a couple of things about the nature of investment in education research and also the nature of education research itself. So that's quite an agenda, but I'll do my best. The first point about REF, I suppose, is that its purposes and most aspects of its mechanisms have a constancy about them. And that's important. It's important because it does enable some comparison across the exercises that tend to happen. Dominic said 5 years. Actually, this one was a 7-year window by the time it fell, as it were. That continuity is important. It does mean that the REF, as it were, collectively tries to do a similar task each time it happens, but it also gets a little bit developed. It gets a little bit shifted in line with what the field as a whole, if I can call it that, of higher education-based researchers would like to see. So the purposes pretty much remain as they were several exercises ago. For example, the REF 2021 declared its purposes to be to inform the selective allocation of funding body grant for research and to institutions. So it's trying to do something on behalf of the taxpayer. Secondly, to provide accountability for public investment in research and produce evidence of the benefits of that investment. And thirdly, to provide some benchmarking information which is valuable to some institutions and certainly internationally as well. So these purposes, there are other purposes that are sometimes spelt out on the back of those. They're constant. They go right back to, you know, Swinnerton Dyer talking about the first RAE many years ago. So, basic continuity. There were some changes in the number of sub-panels. I won't go into detail here. You can read about all of this on the REF website. And there were couple of other changes worth mentioning between REF 2014 and 2021. One of those was, of course, the change in the way that institutions were required to to select who they submitted. It went from choose who you'd like to submit, and we want 4 outputs for each one in 2014, to we want everyone who's got responsibility for research, but we know that would generate an enormous workload, so instead of sending us 4 items for each one of those people, we'd like FTE times 2.5. And that resulted in a workload that was roughly comparable to 2014 for this exercise. So that's one major difference. Another would be linked to that, I guess, I mentioned a moment ago, the 7-year window compared to the 6-year window of the previous REF assessment period. Perhaps another important difference was that impact case studies were judged in the same way as last time, but there was no element of impact score drawn from its own statement as there was in 2014. It was a reliance on impact case studies for the impact score. Okay, so decoupling, that's that idea of shifting. It's nothing to do with Gwyneth Paltrow and the bloke from Coldplay. It's to do with decoupling staff from their institutions. So instead of it being about individuals in institutions, it's about institutions. Sort of ref speak, decoupling. So some of the problems, of course, that have been there all along remain. You know, I'm not here to defend the history of ref, far from it. In fact, I think one of the problems, one of the really serious problems, is that institutions are not equally wise or helpful in the way that they use ref internally. It's a bit like Ofsted, actually. You know, I've met recently a secondary school teacher who's retiring early, who is actually unwell, I think, primarily because of the way the school that she works in interprets Ofsted. And I think that's really sad. I mean, it's really, really bad, actually. There's a similar thing in some institutions with the way that ref is interpreted. And often that's based on myths about, you know, what constitutes the legitimate author of an output, which are completely off beam with regard to the ref rules, if you like. So could say more about that, but I think there are problems like that. You know, the immense amount of time and expense involved for institutions in preparing is another problem. These things remain, but I do want to say a bit about what I've previously called reasons to be cheerful about ref. In other words, there are some really valuable aspects that I think are sometimes underappreciated. The first is that thing I've mentioned already, a high degree of continuity as well as development. Secondly, the rules and the process are subject to extensive and genuine consultation. And of course, because of the way the ref works, when you consult, you have to be a bit careful. You can't just listen to certain universities or certain vice-chancellors. You have to listen to bigger units than that. You have to set up the system for consultation to get a wider view that's not anchored in the interests of this or that institution. It embodies, thirdly, a serious set of attempts to minimize gaming. There is always gaming in any system of measurement, particularly if it's high stakes. But there are serious attempts to minimize gaming in the ref. Fourthly, it's bureaucratic, but in a positive sense. You know, we're used to just using bureaucracy as a sort of boo word, aren't we? You know, or it's just bureaucracy, or I hate bureaucracy. In its technical sense, you know, if you've ever read any Weber, you'll know this. A bureaucracy is a way of organizing tasks in the sense that it's meant to be a way of arriving at a transparent set of processes that can be understood, that are rule-governed. So, you know, bureaucracy in that sense. And it takes, as part of that, it takes the avoidance of conflicts of interest really, really seriously. And I think I'll mention it now, I may mention it again. In the panel, we were reminding ourselves at the beginning of every single meeting about avoiding unconscious bias. Everyone went through an awareness-raising program about that. We had an intentions plan about attempting fairness of judgments. We reminded ourselves constantly of the Nolan principles. And I remember joking more than once to my fellow panelists that if they didn't remember what the Nolan principles were, they should have a look at what was going on in Westminster and just do the opposite. I think they then understood what I meant. So, of course, not everybody in Westminster was abusing the Nolan principles. I don't mean that at all, but you know who I mean. Compared to most other mechanisms for quality assessment across a range of education and wider public services, the REF is actually highly distinctive and has some elements of value. And I want to come back to that point before we close. So what kind of things happened with submissions? Well, there were 83 submissions this time, compared to 74 last time. That reflected 2,367 individual researchers, which was an increase, a substantial increase. We looked at 5,278 outputs, 232 impact case studies, and 83 environment statements. Of those 83 submissions, the HEIs were from all 4 countries, 68 from England, 9 from Scotland, 3 from Wales, and 3 from Northern Ireland. Also, I'd add here that again, a point that I want to return to in another slightly different way is that the submissions show external income. One of the things they have to do is detail research income. And I think a nice sort of footnote here is that if you're submitting to the REF, you are incentivized to maximize the legitimate recording. You're not going to forget a grant because you haven't looked carefully enough. You're going to record everything you can. So it's actually quite a good figure for that reason. I think that adds to its validity. It's very difficult to put things in that are not research income, but you're going to count everything that is. So education submissions show external income over the whole assessment period in education as 386 million. And that gives you an annual average of 55 million. But it is less than last time. Last time it was 58 million annual average across education. This time it was 55. And if you add in the fact that, real terms value of 58 million, you might be expecting something like 60. I don't know, I'm not an economist, but you might be expecting something over 60 million by the time we get to this recent REF, but it's not, it's less. I'll come back to that. Interestingly, 6,155 doctoral degrees were awarded, and that's a massive increase on the last REF period. So we're doing lots and lots of that. That is something to celebrate particularly. I'll say a bit more about that too as we go through and compare. This is the submissions shown on some sort of distribution. And we're a very peculiarly shaped field, it has to be said. We've got one institution that submitted well over 300 full-time equivalent staff. We've got quite a few in the sort of mid-range there, but actually only about, 7% in that range, 40 to 49. 6% in the 50 plus, including the very big one. And then we've got a very, very long distribution there of the other submissions, the smallest of which is 5. So quite unusual. I think that does have an impact, and we've written a bit about that in the report. It has an impact on research environments, what you can do in a research environment, what you can invest in, actually, in a research environment. And of course, there are examples of people doing fantastic research, in REF terms, high-scoring research, in very small environments. but it does beg other questions about sustainability, you know, as you'd expect. So there's the distribution there of inputs, of submissions. It's quite similar to last time, this, in terms of the spread, the distribution. The sub-panel, well, who are they? The short answer is they are us. We are the sub-panel. What happens is that learned societies, users of research, get an opportunity to nominate people that they think should be on a panel in their field. I'll jump to the middle of this here. There were 192 nominations for the education sub-panel, and some of those repeated the same people. You know, this body said, get Fred blogs, and this body said, get Fred blogs. This body said, get Frida blogs, and so did that body. So, you know, a few of them multiply up in that way. So there are actually 162 distinctive individuals being mentioned in all these nominations. And BERA was by far the largest nominating body with 58 of those nominations. So very important that, you know, obviously you can't phone up the University of Poppleton and say, who would you like to have on the education panel? You have to do it some other way, and this is the way it's done. From those nominations, of course, a panel has to be constructed, and that's a process that is mainly done by the chair and the deputy chair. But they're not just looking down the list and thinking, oh, I know that person and I don't know that person. Far from it. They're studying the expertise, background, research experience of, and actually quality assessment experience too, because it's often present, of all the people that have been nominated. And then they're comparing that with the survey that institutions were asked to fill in about what they were likely to submit, the intentions survey. And putting those things together is quite a long job. You know, one's got to keep an eye on ending up with a panel that's not full of white males, for example. Far from it, you know, one hopes. So it's a sort of an extended process. The deputy chair and the chair do that together, but they do it in conjunction and in liaison with the chair of the relevant main panel. And in case that passed you by, the REF is organised and sort of structured around 4 main panels, A, B, C, and D. Education sits in main panel C and is one of 12 sub-panels in main panel C. All the others in that main panel are, broadly speaking, the social sciences. So we ended up with a panel of 35. There were 22 full members, 5 impact assessors and 8 output assessors, plus a sub-panel advisor and administrative support as well. And you can see all this online. You can see who they are, what institutions they're affiliated with, basically. As I've just said, the selection process takes into account quite a large number of characteristics, locations, as well as expertise. I mentioned earlier the Nolan principles, very important. Secondly, we were constantly seeking to minimize unconscious bias. We avoided conflicts of interest, like the plague. You know, absolutely avoided conflicts. There's a register kept all the time. It's updated continuously in the process. There's constant checking, particularly by panelists with the chair and the deputy chair, to see if something constitutes a conflict of interest. You know, and these often arise unexpectedly. Somebody says, oh, I'm just looking at this thing I'm going to assess, but perhaps I shouldn't because I once supervised a PhD student who went on to work at this institution. Is that a conflict of interest? The answer actually to that one is no, unless they wrote the article, then maybe it's yes. So there's constant attention to avoiding conflicts of interest, as you would expect, I work at Cardiff University, I did not see a single thing submitted by Cardiff University, and nor did I know the outcomes until the last hour of the last meeting of the sub-panel for Cardiff. So, you know, that's how seriously this was taken, as you'd hope. Everything is read. Calibration happens a great deal. This is where people make judgments on a cross-section of items where there's no conflicts, and then they compare. But that's also not only within the sub-panel, but with main panel C as well. So that there's some sense in which things getting a 4-star in sociology relate to things getting a 4-star in education, for example, or in law, or in econometrics. There's some shared interpretation of the criteria. Allocation, the chair and deductive chair do a lot of allocation of items to individuals, particularly with outputs, of course. Although the impact case studies and the environment statements were done in groups, not by pairs of panelists, as were the outputs. Then there's the assessment process, ongoing moderation of several kinds. As a panelist, I got a list of all panelists, not by name, and all I knew was which one I was. And there was by the time I'd assessed 200 things, there was, you know, an indication of the proportion that I was finding to be 4-star, 3-star, 2-star, 1-star, unclassified, and an indication of the standard deviation. I could see all the others, but not who they were. So we did that all the time, as well as the more focused comparison between individuals, pairs, and sometimes threes. Strong sense of collective responsibility, which I saw as one of my main tasks as chair to engender that, and I think we did end up with that. There is also some international comparison going on via main panel C, and finally this term rigorous generosity, a sort of underlying principle for scoring things as well as you possibly could, not trying to look to knock things down, and I think that persisted. What about outcomes? Well, just look at the lines in bold on this one. I'm going to unpack the others in a minute, briefly. If you look at the headline figures for 2021, which is all of the items put together that are measured, you've got a row of percentages under the star ratings there. 2021, you've got 37% 4-star, 35% 3, 20% was in 2, 7% was in 1, and 1% was in unclassified. That's for all of the submissions put together. If you do the same thing for 2014, you get some different figures, but I hope I've helpfully summarized those in the next slide. No, I haven't. That's fine. We can helpfully summarize them from each of the components in a moment. I guess one thing I would say is that the overall scores for 2021 did go up. And they didn't go up evenly across environment, impact and outputs, as we'll now see. So I just want to, this by the way is all in the report that's readily available online, as is pretty much everything else I say. Let's look at outputs, those two figures from the two exercises. And for me, the headline there is that there was an increase in the proportion of outputs judged to be world leading in the education submissions, and it went up from 21.7% to 29.8%. Now that's between 2 points about 7 years apart. Only 6 members of the panel were in common between the two exercises, although I think that's an important bonus. You can't read immense amounts into that. I think you can, however, say that in a similar process done with equal rigor, a higher proportion, significantly higher proportion of work is measured in a peer review process as being of higher quality. So I think that is an important point. The proportion combined 3- and 4-star of outputs also rose from 61.6 to 67.9 in the same comparison. In the report, you'll see these sorts of paragraphs as well. Just very briefly, for example, outputs, this is the panel's joint view, having got towards the end of the exercise. And this is something all the panelists, sign up to as being their joint impression. Outputs gaining the highest grades demonstrated their originality, significance, and rigor in diverse ways. So there are lots of different ways of doing that, which is why one needs criteria, but also expert peer review. Outputs gaining the highest grades included qualitative, quantitative, and mixed methods studies, and there was no strong association between research excellence and particular methods. Very important that, I think, because there are lots of myths around about that sort of point. Thirdly, outputs gaining the highest grades included theoretically driven as well as empirically driven work. Fourthly, outputs directly concerned with aspects of professional practice gained grades across the whole range, though those gaining lower grades included some that were limited to descriptive or experiential accounts. Important point here, there's nothing wrong with descriptive and experiential accounts. They can be immensely valuable. The point is that REF criteria about originality, significance, and rigor, and peer review that's alert to a whole range of types of research output can find limited to descriptive and experiential not to reach the highest quality ratings. And that's partly about wider significance. It's about wider utility, wider appeal of some of those outputs. Fifth on here, whilst clearly of value, lower graded outputs were often characterised by a number of other things. The panel listed the most common features, one or more of the following. Overclaiming of contribution to knowledge, there was a bit of that amongst some. Weak location in a field. That thing of, we've all read things occasionally, I'm sure, where you think, well, this is fantastic, but why do we need to know it? Hasn't anybody else done anything like this already? How's this moved us on? How's this helpful? So it's some of that. But we're talking about a very small proportion of overall outputs here. Some others had insufficient attention to the justification of samples or case selection. It's an important part of sort of methodological rigor in the type of sampling I would call case study, to know why a case is worth having. What is it about the case that will reveal for other settings and cases? And this is in all the methods textbooks, but there were a couple that didn't do that here and there. And then finally, underdevelopment of criticality and analytical purchase was another example of some of those slightly lower scoring outputs. Okay. Impact. Well, similar comparison going on here. Like outputs, a real success story, I think, for education research. There was a significant increase in the proportion of impact assessed as outstanding from 42.9%, nearly 43% there, to just over 51%. And this, by the way, is a very good outcome in relation to other social sciences, as well as comparing with 2014 in education. And the combined proportion of impact that was both 3-star and 4-star rose from 76.5% to 80%, just over. And I won't dwell on this, but in the report we say, just as we did with outputs, what the characteristics of some of the highest scoring impact case studies were. And they're things that you'd, I'm sure, expect. It's about, does the evidence back up the claim? Incidentally, some of the highest scoring impact case studies had quite modest claims. So that kept coming up, actually. It wasn't the size of the claim. It was the fact that the claim had been made clearly and then was clearly supported by evidence. So there were examples of very big claims being made, but the evidence being a bit too slender for a panelist team to decide that it was backing up the claim. So there we are. And similar points on here, which I'll come back to if we have time. With environment, the story between 2014 and 2021 for education is basically continuity. So a small decrease in the proportion judged as conducive to producing world leading under the criteria for environment, this is. But the proportion of 3- and 4-star combined was almost the same. So a little bit of staying the same, slight decline, can't read too much into that, I don't think, especially as 14, as it says to start here, 14 of the 83 submissions were from institutions that had not submitted in Ref 2014. So, imagine the environment statement usually looks back as well as forward. It talks about, what you've done since the last Ref, if you can, what your goals were. If it's the first education submission you've made, that's much more difficult to, as it were, make a convincing case. Not impossible, but more difficult. And we came to a general view about that too. Just ever so briefly, the strongest submissions provided convincing statements pertaining to strategy, vision, and values, and were coherent. I'll jump to the end as well, something that sometimes got missed off even the environment statements from the biggest institutions, submissions, the strongest ones provided a strong and convincing account of how researchers featured in the submission had contributed to the discipline. What had they done for education research? Sometimes that got forgotten. But the strongest ones certainly made much of it. It's potentially useful to compare the outcomes of education Ref with other social sciences in main panel C, which include things like law, social work, social policy, economics, also the sport and exercise science and tourism, and management and business studies, by far the biggest sub-panel and the biggest number of submissions to that. Education had the second largest number of submissions and the third largest FTE at 2,168. The overall profiles show that education to have exactly the MPC, main panel C average of 4-star quality. So if you look across all the social sciences in Ref, and what percentage of the outputs, the outcomes of the whole exercise, not the outputs, environment and impact. Look across the whole exercise, education is exactly on the main panel C average for 4-star. And I think that's an important message for those that like to draw these comparisons, sometimes in an unwarranted way, I have to say, between different disciplines that feature in the Ref. And on outputs, I'm moving to the middle here, education's 4-star is in the lowest quartile of main panel C. Put crudely, the difference between that and the first figure I mentioned is that the impact outcome is so strong in education. which is quite an interesting, and perhaps one would expect that, quite an interesting point. So in the lowest quartile of main panel C on 4-star outputs, but it's the same as unit of assessment 13, greater than a couple of the others, and close to that last one, 17, is management and business studies, so it's close to that. The last point on here, I sort of come back to, at 6,155 doctoral awards, education is by far the most productive of the social sciences in REF. And what I mean by productive is, given the size of the submissions, we are producing many more doctoral awards than other disciplines. We don't have the biggest volume, that's about 9,000, and it's in business and management, but they've got loads more staff, loads more submissions. So education produces by far the most productive number of doctoral awards, and of course that it includes both PhDs and professional doctorates and other kinds of doctorate actually. Although I haven't done the rather laborious task of looking through all the submissions to tease out the figures. I do intend doing that actually, but I just haven't got around to it yet. I do think it's a very impressive figure, this, and something to celebrate. I promised I would briefly talk about other quality assessment regimes. I will very briefly, and I won't read this table out, but I will reassure you that I've been reading a bit about TEF recently, just by way of example, and particularly some excellent work by Paul Ashwin from Lancaster, who's working with the former minister from some years ago, Charles Clarke. And that analysis of TEF is quite telling when you compare it to REF. And in a nutshell, I'll just pick a couple of these. If you're looking at how things are assessed, look at the top line, the assessment criteria, well, they're explicit in REF. I know they have to be enacted in a peer review process in a group, but they're explicit. And they're mainly consistent over time. Neither of those things are true of TEF. In TEF, the assessment criteria are implicit. There's no shared definition, and there's almost constant evolution of the rules. You know, I mean, if we're looking at REF compared to other quality regimes, TEF's not a bad thing to pick. We could pick something in the health service, or we could pick Ofsted, or we could pick somewhere else in public expenditure. The same story comes through in the other items on this table. Just one other I would mention is the final one on this list, which I call legitimacy. REF gets its legitimacy from being expert peer review and bureaucratic, clear rules, transparent rules. It measures what it says it measures, right? High validity. Research, the quality of research is being measured. If you look at TEF, well, there's institutional case making, there's indirect, very indirect proxy data for the quality of teaching. No one comes and, assesses the quality of teaching for TEF. There's a slender connection, I'd say, to the quality of teaching and low validity. So, given the amount of taxpayer money involved in what lies behind these two exercises, I leave you to, have a think about this. And it's important to criticise REF for its faults, always. It's also important to be critical in that wider sense about how it stacks up as something that reassures the public about how some of its money is being spent. Brings me to my last couple of points. Firstly, investment in educational research. I want to start with the point of comparison. If you go for the sort of best figures we got, which are actually pre-pandemic, just pre-pandemic, and look at public expenditure in the UK. These figures are widely available from the ONS and the Cabinet Office and other places. The annual public expenditure on healthcare in the UK was 225 billion. And that was about 10% of GDP. A lot, very big. In REF, there's a lot of research related to healthcare. And it mainly appears in the units of assessment that come under main panel A. For example, units of assessment 1 to 3, which are clinical medicine, dentistry, nursing and pharmacy, and public health, health services, primary care, and that last one, allied health professions, including dentistry, nursing and pharmacy. So those three panels. There are also, though, bits of health-related research, quite big bits, actually, in psychology, psychiatry and neurosciences and in biological sciences. So all 5 panels of the 6, I think, of those 5 of the 6 in main panel A. But let's just stick with the ones that are really definitely on the money, as it were. Units of assessment 1 to 3. They show an annual research income between them of 2,278 million. If you do the maths and get the proportion of that compared to public expenditure, that's all I'm doing. You know, here's the public expenditure, here's the expenditure on research. How does that look? Well, there it is. It's actually 1% of public expenditure on healthcare that gets spent on research related to healthcare. And I'm not, of course, including things that are just, you know, inside private companies like pharmaceutical companies or whatever. That's sort of outside of this equation. If we include a conservative amount of the research income in some of the other units of assessment, this rises to 1.2%. So there's a little benchmark. How about education? Well, before the pandemic, total spending on education in the UK stood at 104 billion, or about 4.4% of national income, as it then was in the UK. So what about research? Well, the total research income evidenced in REF 2021 for educational research shows an annual average of 55 million. So doing the same sum, compare that to public expenditure. 55 million is 0.00053 or 0.053%. That's about 1/20th of 1% of 104 billion. In other words, it would need to be 20 times bigger to match even a conservative estimate of the rate of recent investment in healthcare research. And I've done a little diagram. Let's put it, I tried to do a diagram, but this is what happens if you put that data into the standard diagram drawing stuff in PowerPoint. You get the 1%, you see the 1% there on the bottom of healthcare, a little blue stripe, and of course the orange stripe is total public expenditure on healthcare. Do the same with education, it doesn't even show up, because it's only 1/20th of 1%. I thought that showed quite graphically the point I was trying to make. And, you know I could do all those things where you only show the, you know, you amplify the bottom bit of the graph, but then you can't see the whole picture. So there we are. That is a problem, I think, and it brings me to my concluding thoughts. First, the sub-panel noted 3 matters that they felt to be fundamental to the future health, sustainability and vibrancy of education research. 1, I'll just read these out. Concerns about the nature and general level of research investment. An average of 58 million per annum in REF 2014 to 55 million in REF 2021. And here's a quote from the report. The sub-panel noted that 55 million is a very small amount in the context of annual public expenditure on education, and that there has been a decline of major national programmed funding. and also in international opportunities. The second point I'd make about this is that the sub-panel drew, looking across the nature of the research, and I've not really said anything about this, but it's in the report, about the nature of outputs being submitted, the nature of impact case studies and so on. Second point, while there were notable exceptions, little of the research seen focused on educational engagements with climate change or on education for environmental sustainability. There were exceptions, but one would expect, we felt collectively, to see more work focused in those areas. Thirdly, REF provides a strong evidence that educational research has impressive national and international reach and responds well to the needs of policy, relevant professional groups, the public and specific communities. And here we had in mind, before I read the last bit, we had in mind a prominent recent report from the Royal Society and the British Academy called Harnessing Education Research, which is basically an argument for coordinating demand and supply. We think that's something to be slightly wary of as an argument. So here we are. Crucially, however, the best education research is not confined to the role of supplier responding to demands that are articulated by or on behalf of these stakeholders. Education research is also itself a vital source of new ideas, insights, perspectives, challenges to current thinking, policy and practice, making a valuable and distinctive contribution to democratic life. After we'd written this, collectively decided that it was what we all wanted to say, I came across something I'd read before which said almost the same thing. So last word to a previous president of BERA, Jeff Whitty, who said in his presidential address in 2005, good educational research helps people reconsider issues. It helps them think differently. It helps them reconceptualize what the problem is and how prevalent it is. And it helps them discard some old assumptions, and it punctures old myths. And I thought that puts it even better than we did in the report. Thank you.
Right, we've got just over 5 minutes for questions. Excellent, I see a hand up here already. So let's start with the gentleman at the front there, and I'll join David.
Thank you. It's Jack White at Northwest University in South Africa, University of Cumbria. Yeah, I really like that last two slides. Now, can I just focus on the last paragraph of Jeff Whitty's presidential address, where Jeff was actually advocating a change in the name of the British Educational Research Association so that it should become Education Research. Now, I'm just fascinated whether David, and also Dominic, has got any view about whether that idea about an academic discipline where we focused on education, and then the last two slides, which I really liked, had educational research 3 times. Now, is there a distinction in your minds between education research and educational research? And if so, what is it? Thanks.
Right, very good question. I have to say I'm aware of that debate earlier, and I felt that it wasn't going anywhere. I felt that the terms may as well be used interchangeably. And that's because some of the claims about educational research were an attempt to suggest that education could research things, the world of education could research things in a thoroughly distinctive manner. I get that it's varied, I get that it's informed by a range of philosophies, practices and so on, but that to me never held enough water to want to rename the entire enterprise. So I'm afraid in the REF process we use the terms interchangeably. Thank you.
Thank you. Do we have another question? We have still just a few minutes left. Excellent. Somebody at the front here. Thank you.
Hi, thanks. Andrew Clapham from Nottingham Trent University. I'm making a shameless plug for the paper that we're going to be presenting tomorrow, because our paper has done an analysis of the 2014 REF and looking at how initial teacher education research focused, or perhaps more appropriately didn't focus in that. So our analysis, we kind of came up with less than 5% of the returns in 2014, the outputs, pertain to initial teacher education, and then put that in contrast to the amount of that ITE contributes to schools of education. So I'm wondering what your thoughts might be as to why ITE focused research focused so little in 2014, and we're in at the moment of actually trying to see how much it focused in 2014. We think very similar.
Thank you. So I haven't done the analysis that you've done pertaining to in such fine detail. Okay. My impression is that there was research focused on teacher education, but it wasn't a high volume. As you say, one might expect more of it, given its prevalence as activity. I think that it's a good example of how programmatic funding could make a difference. In other words, you know, even if you did the crude thing of saying, well, let's look at this 104 billion pounds, where does it go? You'd look, you know, you'd say, for example, oh, I see that 7.5 billion of that goes to FE colleges, you know, and yet we know almost nothing about them in terms of certain areas of research. I mean, there are now more exceptions to that, but, you know, that would be a rationale. You could do the same with teacher education. And I think that behind what you've asked and what you've said it contributes to the same broader point that I would make about programmatic funding for education research. And I'd put the question starkly. I'd say, you know, as a society, as a public, as voters, as taxpayers, are we happy that something that takes up such a massive amount of public expenditure is not subject to critical independent research in its major dimensions? Seemingly we have been so far, or recently. So thank you for the point.
Do we have any further questions? Yes, thank you, Mary. By the way, please do send me your paper if I can't get to your session. It sounds really interesting.
Thank you. Mary Richardson from UCL Institute of Education. So I was interested in two things that you said. The fact that you made the comparison with medical research, because I think that's quite a tough one to compare ourselves with in terms of how publicly the cost benefit will be analysed in terms of what medical research does for the public good. I'm not saying that's right. I'm talking about this kind of culture we're in, where arguments at the moment are very much yes, no, and not much in between. So I was thinking, as a community, now that we're definitely coming out of, well, we're slowly coming out of into this new world, how are we going to promote the value of our work and of our research for the public good? And I think this is a really important question we all need to ask ourselves. Not only about what we do, but how we tell people about what we're doing.
It's a really good point. I completely agree with you about the difficulties of comparison with medical-based or healthcare research. Although, you know, quite frankly, I would be far happier if we had a fraction, a bigger fraction, of the kind of proportions that are enjoyed for research in that field. Your bigger point about how do we promote the value of educational research in the public eye, I think there is unfortunately a need, perhaps unfortunately, a need to find political footholds for this, and they're never quite what you'd want. I'm thinking back to how education became absolutely the top priority for a previous government. But what they meant by it, most of the time, was what a certain narrow section of economists think it is, which is about upskilling for international competitiveness and about human capital. And that's important, but it's only one tiny corner for me of what education is for and what it does. So, you know, there was a sort of a deal, if you like, then, which was exemplified by the Teaching and Learning Research Programme, I thought, a large and varied programme. And sure, it did some of the stuff that would have been welcomed by New Labour. But it did lots of other things as well that were very useful and demonstrably important. So it's a long-winded way of saying we do need to nurture a political appreciation as well as a general public appreciation. Both of those things, probably. Thank you.
And I want to thank you, David, and the people who've asked the questions, which show that we're right at the start of learning from the incredible work that David and the panel have done. There are important things for BERA to reflect on and to help us continue to work with all of you in making education research and education practice and education policy more in the ways we'd like it, perhaps. But let's give a final round of applause to David. Thank you all. Thank you, David.